When Yukio Mishima published Kinkaku, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, 1956, post-war Japanese literature found one of its most unsettling and intellectually refined expressions of aesthetic nihilism. Based on the real arson of Kyoto's Zen temple in 1950, the novel reimagines this act of destruction not as a sensational event but as a philosophical parable about the unbearable tension between beauty and human imperfection. Through the stuttering novice monk Mizoguchi, Mishima constructs a portrait of obsession where spiritual longing, envy, and violence become. The burning of the temple becomes less a crime than a metaphysical eruption, a desperate attempt to reconcile the limits of the self with the infinite, even divine, indifference of beauty. It is a novel in which the most sacred form of aesthetic contemplation culminates in annihilation, and where destruction operates as a mode of knowledge. Mishima's transformation of the arson from historical fact to a work of pure intellectual precision marks an essential transition in post-war Japanese fiction. The ruined temple serves as symbolic condensation of Japan's own spiritual disintegration after its defeat in World War II. Yet Mishima refuses political reading. Instead, he isolates the philosophical tension at the heart of all aesthetic experience, the inescapable violence implicit in perceiving perfection. The shimmering gold pavilion, standing serenely over its reflecting pond, embodies the impossible harmony that drives Mizoguchi toward madness. The contradiction between Zen impermanence and human desire for permanence is translated into pathology. Mishima thus redefines realism as metaphysical realism, a literature where concrete details are instruments of ontological investigation. Mizoguchi's stammer has often been understood as emblem of post-war Japan's moral aphasia, yet within the novel, it evolves into a formal device, a rhythm that punctuates thought and reincarnates silence into language. The stammer signifies more than social inadequacy, it manifests aesthetic paralysis. He cannot speak because language, which should mediate between self and world, collapses before beauty. This linguistic incapacity fuels his voyeurism, his need to contemplate rather than participate. His fascination with the temple stems from this incapacity. Each time he faces the perfection of its structure, he experiences both adoration and humiliation. Beneath this tension lies Mishima's broader diagnosis. The modern self is defined by the incapacity to inhabit ideals it creates. Hence, it oscillates between worship and annihilation. The burned Golden Pavilion becomes the crucible of this pathology. Mishima uses the Zen principle of mujo, impermanence, not to affirm serenity, but to expose contradiction. The temple represents aesthetic permanence masquerading as spiritual truth. It stands as contradiction made visible, a monument to impermanence that denies impermanence. Mizoguchi's act of burning converts the religious principle into literal practice, the destruction of form as purification of essence. By misreading Buddhist detachment as physical erasure, he exposes the danger of aestheticizing faith. Flame becomes his enlightenment, destruction his meditation. This misinterpretation is not an accident but Mishima's warning: pure ideas, stripped of ethical restraint, transform into violence. The final fire is not rebellion against Zen but its distorted fulfillment. Mishima couches this psychological drama within the wider context of post-war anxiety and moral collapse. Japan, under Westernization, replaced inner rigor with material reconstruction. The temple, once a spiritual axis, has become spectacle for consumption, an image of transcendence commodified for tourists. Through Mizoguchi's sickened gaze, beauty itself becomes contaminated with vulgarity. The crime is therefore also cultural allegory. Japan burns its own soul under the guise of admiration. Mishima's protagonist does not destroy beauty out of hatred alone but out of desperate fidelity to a purity already lost. His act becomes symbolic seppuku, the traditional ritual's suicide reinterpreted as aesthetic cleansing. In this sense, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion anticipates Mishima's own obsession with purification through destruction, culminating in his real-life death 14 years later. The structural precision of the novel amplifies its philosophical implications. Each chapter unfolds with mathematical control, tracing the protagonist's descent into obsession as if documenting an experiment in metaphysics. Mishima's sentences are meticulous, crystalline, suffused with tension between lyricism and logic. The language achieves the severity of architecture. The prose seems carved rather than written, reflecting Mishima's belief that art, like the body, must be disciplined through pain. The Golden Pavilion's incandescence is mirrored in the novel's formal perfection. Every line balances restraint and fever. Reading it feels like staring into polished surface until vision breaks, a literary equivalent of self-mutilation through beauty. At the center of this aesthetic universe lies the paradox that perception of beauty provokes destruction. Mishima's narrator concludes that the sublime cannot coexist with ordinary existence. To see perfection is to suffer. The mind seeks to obliterate the unbearable distance between ideal and self. Thus, destruction is the highest form of possession. Mishima's treatment of fire dramatizes this with surgical purity, flame as energy that transforms contemplation into act, thought into deed. When Mizoguchi finally sets the temple ablaze, the novel achieves an ecstatic equilibrium. The boundary between imagination and world disappears. The beauty of the burning pavilion transcends moral categories, it is simultaneously sin, revelation, and art. This is where Mishima's aesthetic extremism reaches its culmination, action replaces interpretation. Absolute form reveals itself through ruin. Psychologically, Mizoguchi's crime results from internalization of impotence. His stammer isolates him from social and erotic fulfillment. Without speech, he cannot enter the symbolic network that assigns meaning to existence. Every humiliation accumulates as resentment toward the visible world. His first sexual experiences, awkward, failed, or voyeuristic, mark the fusion of eros and thanatos. Desire translates into annihilation. When he fails to sleep with a prostitute, his shame transforms into metaphysical rage. If beauty cannot be possessed by touch, it must be possessed by destruction. The body denied becomes agent of fire. Mishima thus reconfigures sexuality as instrument of aesthetic violence. Eros and thanatos coincide. Every desire becomes urge for erasure. The novel's eroticism is intellectual, not sensual. It transforms physical frustration into symbolic combustion. Fire becomes orgasm transposed into metaphysical register. Through this, Mishima relates individual pathology to civilization's death drive. Modern culture, separated from sacred continuity, sublimates its desires into art, then consumes the art itself, a pattern mirrored in the burning of the temple. The conflagration is both personal and collective, liberation from beauty's tyranny. After the fire, Mizoguchi experiences momentary serenity. For him, the void is perfection, only in absence can he breathe. Mishima thus defines nihilism not as despair but as aesthetic equilibrium, the moment when existence and non-existence coincide in pure form. Mishima's relationship to Zen thought remains complex, oscillating between reverence and violation. Zen teaches non-attachment, the dissolution of self through awareness of impermanence. Yet Mishima's protagonist performs a parody of detachment, he annihilates the object instead of transcending the desire. This reveals Mishima's fundamental skepticism toward the possibility of spiritual peace in modern life. For his characters, transcendence is conceivable only through physical extremity, discipline, violence, or death. The artist replaces the monk, fire replaces meditation. The sacred re-enters modernity through aesthetic perversion. Therefore, Mishima's Zen is not religious but tragic, a recognition that purity must destroy itself to remain pure. Throughout the novel, Mishima's prose demonstrates fascination with Western existentialism, Nietzsche's will to power, Dostoevsky's criminal metaphysics, Sartre's nausea, but he filters these through Japanese sensibility where beauty and death are inseparable. Like Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov, Mizoguchi intellectualizes his crime as moral test, the killing of beauty rather than of man. Yet unlike Raskolnikov, he never seeks redemption. Mishima rejects the Christian dialectic of sin and forgiveness. His moral universe allows only two categories, form and collapse. Good and evil are aesthetic conditions, not ethical ones. The purity of an act depends on its style, not its motive. Hence, the burning of the temple becomes pure precisely because it transcends justification. It is art reduced to essence, flawless gesture without meaning. One of Mishima's most striking conceptual performances is the way he turns the protagonist's speech defect into narrative principle. The rhythm of stammering, hesitation, repetition, fracture, echoes through syntax. The text becomes respiration of silence. Through this technique, Mishima materializes the fragmentation of consciousness. The reader hears thought stumbling against language, form reproduces neurosis. Silence becomes aesthetic matter. When the temple burns, language itself releases, the stammer resolves into the roar of flame. Speech returns as soundless illumination, the word made fire. Here, writing mirrors combustion, the novel itself burns as it narrates burning. The motif of the mirror, particularly the temple reflected in its pond, extends this idea. Reflection doubles beauty, transforming it into illusion. Mizoguchi's obsession targets not reality but its mirrored image. He confuses reflection with essence, his passion belongs to simulacrum. By destroying the temple, he eliminates both the real and the reflected worlds, erasing the distinction between being and appearance. For Mishima, this allegorizes modernity's crisis, the replacement of authenticity by representation. The mirror becomes both aesthetic device and metaphysical trap. Beauty, once mirrored, becomes unreachable. Destruction is the only way to restore unity, to rupture the mirage. In formal terms, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion represents Mishima's total control of narrative architecture. No element is casual, the structure mirrors the temple itself, symmetrical, luminous, and destined to die. Chapters advance like ritual steps toward conflagration. The novel nourishes tension not through external events but through interior escalation. The burning emerges not as shock but as necessity. Style here is destiny. The relationship between body and spirit constitutes another central axis. Although the novel centers on architecture, its true focus is corporeality, weakness, deformity, and discipline. Mizoguchi's frail body, his stammer, and his physical inadequacy contrast with Mishima's ideal of the sculpted, martial physique. The protagonist's crime compensates for bodily impotence, destruction as substitute for strength. This connects individual pathology to national condition. Postwar Japan's emasculation mirrors Mizoguchi's humiliati. The temple's incineration thus becomes reenactment of national suicide, Japan burning its aesthetic identity to preserve its purity. Why, the irony is cruel, what survives is only image, not essence. The real temple was rebuilt, its new splendor neutralized the original tragedy. Mishima's Visio, however, freezes in that moment of Rui, refusing restoration. For him, resurrection dilutes beauty. Why, eternity exists only through finality. Fire in Japanese culture symbolizes renewal through purification by destruction. Mishima subverts this symbolism. His flames cleanse nothing. They reveal emptiness beneath form, void without promise of rebirth. Conflagration produces no redemption, only exposure of futility. Flames articulate absurd transcendence in secular world. Within that futility lies paradoxical freedom. Once beauty is destroyed, man need not worship anymore. Mizoguchi reaches silence of mind. The burnt temple contains nothing, therefore it is perfect. Nihilistic completion is Mishima's aesthetic ethics, existence ends to achieve beauty. The novel's tone heightens tension between clarity and cruelty. Mishima avoids psychological sentimentality. Narrator's introspection shows icy precision, emotion reduced to analysis. Readers are seduced by intellect yet recoil from cruelty. Confessional mode evokes Dostoevsky, filtered through French classic control. Each sentence so controlled it suffocates. Guilt becomes geometric, passion mathematical. Affect is hypnotic detachment, moral horror in aesthetic perfection. Irony is deliberate, evil appears as symmetry not chaos. Philosophically, Mishima extends Japan's obsession with mono no aware and discipline. Beauty's transience once bred serenity. Mishima twists that serenity into torment. Aware becomes agony. No longer accepting impermanence, his character retaliates through destruction. Burning moment becomes grotesque parody of seasonal change. Permanent autumn, where things must die to stay unforgettable. He transforms classical sensibility into modern pathology. Comparatively, Mishima's narrative resonates with European modernism. Particularly with Kafka's Metamorphosis. Where Kafka externalized guilt through transformation, Mishima externalizes it through combustion. Both protagonists suffer alienation within ossified cultural orders. Both enact grotesque liberation that ends in isolation. Industrial Europe produced insect metamorphosis, spiritual Japan produced temple fire. Kafka's absurdity is bureaucratic, Mishima's is metaphysical. In both, redemption is denied. Artists' only recourse, form perfected through failure. Critical reception mirrors the unease it creates. Contemporary readers saw Mizoguchi as emblem of cultural sickness. Others recognized philosophical allegory of modernity itself. Later critics placed it beside Camus' The Stranger, a study of existential numbness. Yet Mishima differs in intensity. Camus embraces lucidity of absurdity, Mishima demands its immolation. His aesthetic is not passive revolt, but violent purification. Thus the Temple of the Golden Pavilion transcends national context. It addresses a universal dilemma, living under tyranny of beauty. Autobiographically, the novel prefigures author's own fate. Mishima's life was relentless performance of his fictional ideals. Physical discipline, aesthetic absolutism, ceremonial death. His 1970 seppuku after failed coup, turns literature into action. Principle enacted, thought without deed is shameful. Hence the novel reads as rehearsal for self-destruction. An instruction manual for imagination-made performance. Boundary between author and character dissolves, both seek liberation through annihilating beauty they cannot inhabit. Temple's flames anticipate author's sword. Yet Mishima's extremity invites ethical discomfort. Can beauty be sanctified through violence? Can destruction create purity not emptiness? The novel refuses resolution. Its conclusion suspends reader between repulsion and fascination. Temple burns, meaning remains opaque. Indeterminacy is real horror, aesthetic consciousness complicit in violence. Same sensibility that perceives perfection, creates impulse to extinguish it. Mishima's discipline dismantles romantic redemption of art. Art does not save, it devours. Aftermath extends beyond pages. Japan rebuilt pavilion, affirming continuity. Mishima's text insists on ruin as truth. Restored temple becomes symbol of cultural forgetfulness. Ash version remains spiritually authentic, acknowledging impermanence. Two pavilions coexist, physical rebirth and literary phantom. Reader senses which contains more life. Formally, the novel functions through chiaroscuro of language. Discipline against delirium, ascetic surface veiling emotional fire. Each image architectural in clarity. Wood grain, gold reflection, silence before flame. Precision creates sculptural stillness. Beneath stillness lurks explosion of desire. Serenity becomes hysteria seen through control. Style embodies worldview, order from chaos, beauty from death. Literature and bodybuilding share faith in discipline ending in destruction. Novel's deeper argument, language's impotence before beauty. Mizoguchi's stammer dramatizes failure of naming. Words seek perfection, only intensify lack. Prose approaches silence, circling unspeakable center. Fire erupts, language becomes light, mute expression beyond syntax. Art consummates itself by ceasing to exist. Beauty ends in silence. Philosophically, novel belongs to aesthetic metaphysical lineage. Plato's Phaedrus, madness of beauty. Nietzsche's Dionysian, continuity through dissolution. Bertolli's transgression through discontinuity. Mishima unites these currents in Japanese idiom. Zen void meets Western excess, fusion of restraint and madness. Beauty as mode of being, dangerous because it annihilates beholder. After 6 decades, relevance endures. It confronts core anxiety of modern mind toward idealized beauty. In image-saturated world, Mishima's arson becomes prophecy. Digital temple glitters, replicated endlessly, inviting same erasure. Thus novel transcends boundaries, not Japanese only but perennial. Each generation rebuilds its golden pavilion and secretly dreams of burning it. In evaluating Mishima's legacy, scholars divide over politics versus aesthetics. That division misreads his intent. For Mishima, politics was theater, aesthetic was ontology. Ultranationalism masked metaphysical despair. He sought purity not in ideology, but in form. Destruction of temple was not political metaphor, but metaphysical release. Beauty when absolute demands sacrifice. World cannot sustain perfection without rupturing. Mishima merely dramatized that necessity. Finally, novel's concluding gesture returns to silence. After burning, Mizoguchi narrates calm not ecstasy. Fire consumes chaos within him. He stands before emptiness, complete. Stillness without remorse embodies Mishima's vision. Enlightenment through extremity, peace through obliteration. Reader exits haunted, aware same logic governs aesthetic experience. To perceive beauty fully, is to feel desire to destroy it. Mishima's triumph, articulating paradox with unbearable precision. The temple of the Golden Pavilion remains literature's most exquisite argument. Love of beauty, indistinguishable from longing for death. In austere firelight, we glimpse Japan's history and universal architecture of desire. A temple perpetually burning, endlessly rebuilt, endlessly destroyed.